Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere calm, quiet, and just a little bit claustrophobic. I want you to take a deep breath. Loosen your shoulders. If you're listening in bed, pull the blanket up. Let the world fade out a little. Because tonight, we're stepping into the dim stone corridors of a medieval convent, where prayers echoed off cold walls, candles flickered in the draught, and silence was supposed to mean holiness. But, as it turns out, silence can hide quite a lot. This is the story of what medieval nuns did when no one was watching. Spoiler, it wasn't all praying. Let's set the scene. It's somewhere in the 13th century. The air smells faintly of beeswax, incense, and damp parchment. Inside the convent, women live behind thick walls built for devotion. And let's be honest, containment. These were not cozy places. They were stone fortresses for the soul. The floors were cold. The food was repetitive. And the daily routine could make even the holiest person quietly question her life choices. Nuns were supposed to live in enclosure, meaning they didn't leave the convent, and outsiders weren't supposed to come in. In theory, it was spiritual isolation. In practice, it was a social experiment. Because when you lock a group of women in together for decades, with minimal contact with the outside world, you don't just get serenity. You get gossip, power hierarchies, secret notes, maybe a little black market trading of wine and love letters. It's human nature. Now, not every nun joined willingly. Some did. The genuinely pious ones, who wanted a life of devotion, stability, and no men named Jeff trying to inherit their dowry. But others? They were basically voluntold to join. If you were the third daughter in a noble family, your parents didn't exactly have a grand plan for you. The oldest girl married for politics. The second might marry for backup. You, the third or fourth? Congratulations. You were getting a veil and a vow of chastity before you even learned to flirt. Joining a convent meant your family didn't have to pay a large dowry. It was cheaper than marrying you off, and it looked good spiritually. A nice win-win for everyone, except you. So inside those walls you got a mix of personalities. The devout, the resigned, the bored, and the ones who thought, surely this can't be my entire life. Let's float into one of those convents now. It's late evening. The bell has just rung for Compline, the last prayer of the day. The sisters file into the chapel, voices murmuring Latin hymns in the dim light. It sounds peaceful, holy even. But just beyond that choir screen, a nun is quietly hiding a piece of parchment in her sleeve. It's not scripture. It's a letter, maybe to her brother, maybe to a secret lover. Because yes, there were love letters in convents. The art of secret communication. Medieval nuns were surprisingly creative when it came to bending the rules. Some wrote to priests, confessors, or local nobles, under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance. Sometimes that guidance involved very flowery compliments and a suspicious number of metaphors about divine love. A 14th century nun named Clarissa once doodled herself swinging from the tail of an illuminated letter in a manuscript, a playful self-portrait right in the middle of a holy text. You can almost imagine her doing it after hours, when the abbess had gone to bed. A little rebellion in ink. Then there was Hildegard of Bingen, who technically was a devout mystic and scholar, but also wrote letters to powerful men all over Europe, advising them on politics and theology. She basically became a celebrity nun. She ran her convent like a CEO with divine inspiration and really strong opinions on everyone else's moral behavior. If you ever think convent life was dull, imagine a 12th century woman running a correspondence, empire by candlelight, while also composing celestial music and claiming visions from God. Hildegard was multitasking centuries before it was trendy. But of course, not everyone had Hildegard's privileges. Most convents were smaller, poorer, and much stricter. Daily life followed a rhythm called the divine office, which split the day into 8 sections for prayer. You'd wake before dawn, pray in the cold chapel, eat a small meal, probably bread, maybe cheese if you were lucky. Then spend the day copying manuscripts, tending gardens, or making herbal medicine. And through it all, silence. Long hours of it. Some nuns used that silence well. They learned to read and write Latin, something most men couldn't do. Others just slowly lost their minds and started having visions, which conveniently counted as a sign of holiness. You can imagine the church taking notes like possible divine ecstasy or boredom. Hard to tell. Forbidden friendships, another thing the church didn't love. Emotional closeness. Theologians were deeply suspicious of women getting attached to each other, which of course happened constantly. Inside the convent, your only company was other women. You ate together, prayed together, slept in the same dormitory, shared every hour of every day. Friendships formed. Deep ones, and sometimes they crossed into something else. We have letters from nuns that read with startling tenderness. Confessions of love, longing, even jealousy. Historians debate whether these were spiritual, romantic, or something in between, but the church definitely panicked about it. One medieval bishop wrote that nuns should not hold hands, hug too much, or kiss without necessity, which is exactly the kind of rule you only write when it's already a problem. So yes, within those cloisters, there were secret romances. Quiet, coded, full of risk and candlelight. And sometimes, heartbreak. Because the penalty for breaking vows wasn't just shame. It could mean imprisonment in your own convent, isolation, or forced confession before your entire community. The convent economy, when we picture nuns, we tend to imagine poverty and simplicity. But many convents were surprisingly wealthy. Some owned land, livestock, and vineyards. Running a convent was basically like managing a small feudal estate. The abbess was both spiritual leader and administrator. She oversaw finances, hired workers, and sometimes lent money. In other words, she was a medieval businesswoman, wearing a habit instead of a crown. Abbesses often came from noble families, which meant they understood power, and sometimes they used it. In France, some abbesses held feudal courts, and even had their own vassals. In England, the Abbess of Barking was treated like minor royalty. She entertained kings, owned manors, and managed a household larger than most castles. So yes, under the vows of humility and poverty, there was a very practical layer of wealth management. You had to keep the place running, and if that meant bending a few rules about earthly possessions, well, God would understand. Let's glide into the 14th century. By now, the church had started worrying that convents were getting too comfortable, too independent, too social. So they sent in reformers, men with clipboards, or the medieval version of them, to reinvigorate spiritual discipline. This meant stricter rules, more supervision, and less fun. But reforms always worked better on paper than in real life, because for every pious sister devoted to prayer, there was another one sneaking wine from the infirmary cellar, or hoarding fabric for prettier veils, or writing letters to the local bishop that began suspiciously with, "Beloved in Christ." The human spirit has limits, even in a wimple. When nuns became artists and healers, despite the restrictions, convents were some of the few places where women could actually do things. They composed music, painted illuminated manuscripts, brewed medicine, and educated girls from noble families. Many convents became centers of learning, quiet schools tucked away from the chaos of plague and politics. Nuns learned to read, write, and sometimes even study theology, philosophy, or medicine, subjects completely off limits to most women outside the walls. In Germany, convent apothecaries produced herbal remedies and healing balms sold to nearby villages. And in Italy, some nuns became accomplished painters, creating devotional art that still hangs in museums today. So yes, while the outside world called them secluded, they were often more educated and skilled than the women who married into noble families. Ironically, the walls that imprisoned them also protected their intellectual freedom. The occasional scandal, of course, not every convent was a serene paradise of piety. Some gained reputations for, let's call it, moral flexibility. There were nuns caught drinking too much wine, nuns accused of gambling, fighting, or sneaking out at night. One English abbess was even charged with turning her convent into what a medieval chronicler politely called a place of worldly pleasures. Translation, a brothel with better architecture. The church cracked down on these scandals with righteous fury. But honestly, they kept happening. Because wherever you put people, you get people problems. Jealousy, desire, power struggles, even among those who'd sworn to be holy. Night in the convent. Let's close this part of the story slowly. Imagine the convent at night. The fires have gone out. The bells are silent. The sisters lie in their narrow beds, cloaked in the dark. Some dream of heaven. Some dream of the world beyond the walls. And some, perhaps, are already awake, quietly writing by candlelight, or slipping into the corridor to meet someone in the shadows of the cloister. Because devotion and desire have always lived side by side, and the medieval convent was never just a house of God. It was a mirror of the human soul. Hey guys, still awake? Good. Or maybe just barely, which is even better. Let's keep drifting. Last time we left our nuns sleeping, or pretending to, in their narrow beds, the air thick with incense and suppressed thoughts. But as the centuries went on, some of those quiet women decided they'd had enough. The problem with holy obedience for the church, Nuns were supposed to be the ideal symbol of purity and obedience. Women who surrendered their will entirely to God. But for the women themselves, obedience often translated to never make a decision again. The rules were strict, and the punishments for disobedience were, let's say, uncreative. Isolation, fasting, public confession, or, if you were particularly bold, being physically locked in a cell called an anchor hold to pray about your sins, which honestly sounds less like spiritual healing and more like medieval HR. But some women figured out creative ways to rebel without technically breaking the rules. They might delay a command by claiming illness. They might feign divine visions to justify doing what they already wanted to do. And some simply left. The runaway nuns of Saxony, one of my favorite quiet little rebellions, happened in the early 16th century, in a convent in Saxony, Germany. At this point, the Reformation was just starting to stir things up. Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, and suddenly half of Europe was rethinking their religious contracts. Inside one convent, a group of nuns read Luther's pamphlets and had what can only be described as an existential crisis. They realized, in modern terms, that maybe God didn't actually require them to be locked up forever. So in 1523, 12 nuns decided to escape. They wrote a letter to Martin Luther himself, yes, the big guy, asking for help. And Luther, being Luther, said, sure, why not? He found a sympathetic merchant who smuggled the women out. In barrels. Literal fish barrels. Imagine it. A midnight escape from the convent, 12 women crawling into barrels like sanctified sardines, being wheeled out past the guards. No dramatic chase, no shouts, just a quiet, fishy getaway that became one of the strangest footnotes in religious history. One of those nuns, Katharina von Bora, later married Luther himself. So yes, she went from barrel escapee to Mrs. Reformation. Talk about a career move, mystic visions and questionable miracles. But not all nuns wanted to leave. Some found power within the convent, not through rebellion, but revelation. The Middle Ages loved a good mystic. Someone who claimed direct communication with God was like the spiritual equivalent of having a blue checkmark. And because men tended to ignore women unless they said something divine was happening, mystical visions became a kind of loophole. Take Saint Catherine of Siena, for example. She lived in the 14th century, and supposedly had visions of Jesus so vivid that she once claimed to have received a mystical wedding ring from him. Made of his foreskin. Yes, you heard that right. There's no way to make that sentence sound less weird. Catherine was deeply respected, canonized as a saint, and is still considered a doctor of the church, which means theologians had to take that story very seriously. But Catherine also wielded real influence. She advised popes, mediated political disputes, and wrote scathing letters to corrupt churchmen, all under the authority of her visions. It was a clever trick. If God was your source, no man could outrank you. So while on the surface she was the perfect nun, beneath the veil she was running a one-woman public relations campaign for divine female authority. The wildly suspicious case of Sister Benedetta. Let's glide over to Italy for a moment, to meet Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century nun from Tuscany. Benedetta was, at first, a model of holiness. She claimed to have visions of angels and saints, spoke in tongues, and even bore the stigmata, those mystical wounds resembling Christ's. The church adored her. For a while, then things got weird. Her visions became increasingly personal. She said that an angel named Splenditello, yes, really, appeared to her, and occasionally, took physical form. Her fellow nuns started reporting strange noises coming from Benedetta's cell. Eventually, an investigation found that her angel was actually another nun, and just like that, Benedetta went from holy visionary to public scandal. She was removed from power, quietly imprisoned within the convent, and her name vanished from church records. But centuries later, her story resurfaced, and historians, perhaps unsurprisingly, found it fascinating. Because beneath all the theology and moral panic, Benedetta's story revealed what life in confinement could do to human desire, imagination and loneliness. She wasn't just sinning, she was surviving. The convent as stage now. One thing that's easy to forget is that convents were not invisible little places tucked away from the world. They were public, and they performed holiness. When noble visitors came, the nuns would line up in the choir stalls and sing beautifully orchestrated hymns. They'd display relics, host feast days, and show off their embroidery and manuscripts, the medieval equivalent of brand management. But of course, appearances could be deceiving. Behind the angelic music, there might be feuds over leadership. Behind the altar cloth, a secret stash of letters or trinkets. And behind the confessional curtain, whispered stories that would never make it to the bishop's reports. Some convents even developed reputations, the strict ones, the lax ones, and the ones that were basically social clubs for noblewomen pretending to be devout while wearing silk under their habits. The church kept trying to reform them. The nuns kept adapting. It was an ongoing tug-of-war between faith and human nature, a quiet kind of power, even with the restrictions. Convents offered women a rare thing, authority. An abbess could rule over dozens of sisters, control property, and manage correspondence with bishops and kings. She could decide what books were read, what medicines were made, and how discipline was enforced. In a world where women were usually property themselves, that kind of power was extraordinary. Some abbesses even defied the church directly. One English abbess, Joan of Leeds, famously faked her own death in 1318, leaving behind a dummy corpse to escape the convent. According to church records, she then chose the way of carnal lust, which, translation, she ran off to live a normal life. It's hard not to imagine her grinning as she slipped out under cover of darkness, leaving her fake corpse to do the praying for her. The strange economics of salvation. Let's float now into the quieter corners of convent life. The bookkeeping. Because salvation, like everything in the Middle Ages, came with an invoice. Many families donated money, land, or even food to convents in exchange for prayers. You could literally pay nuns to pray for your soul. It was called intercessory prayer, but it was basically a medieval subscription service for divine favor. And since noble families had plenty of guilt, from wars, inheritances, or the occasional murder, business was good. The nuns recorded these obligations carefully, turning their convents into miniature bureaucracies. Rows of parchment entries, seals, and signatures, all in the name of eternity. It sounds dull, but it meant survival. Without those donors, the convent's candles would go out, the walls would crumble, and the silence would truly become silence. So yes, even holiness had an economic spreadsheet. When the outside world intruded, convents were built to be isolated, but they couldn't stay untouched. Wars passed nearby, plagues came knocking, and sometimes kings decided they wanted the land. During the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, English convents were forcibly closed. Some nuns were sent home, often to families who didn't really want them back. Others resisted, clinging to their vows as their cloisters were stripped bare. For many of these women, the convent had been their entire world, a strange mix of prison, home, and identity. Losing it meant losing everything. One letter from a displaced nun simply says, "I have no house, no friends, no place in this world." It's a haunting little line, written centuries ago, but it still feels human and raw, because for all their supposed holiness, nuns were just people trying to make peace with lives they didn't always choose. The hidden histories in the margins. The most fascinating thing about all this is how little of it was meant to survive. We know these stories mostly because of accidents. Letters that escaped censors, confessions that made it into church records, or doodles left in manuscripts. In some old books, you can still see faint sketches, a nun drawing flowers, a face, a bird, tiny signs that say, "I was here," and that's the beauty of this strange history. For all the silence imposed on them, these women still left echoes, in ink, in rumor, in marginal notes. It's like the past whispering through the parchment. They were holy, they were human, they were both. The convents of medieval Europe weren't just places of prayer. They were laboratories of emotion, pressure, creativity, and quiet defiance. 1,000 private lives hidden beneath layers of obedience and stone. And even though we only glimpse fragments of those lives, a love letter, a rebellion, a sketch, it's enough to remind us that history isn't just about kings and wars. It's about the people who tried to live within impossible walls. Let's keep gliding a little further, into the final stretch, part 3, where we'll meet the visionary nuns who rewrote theology, the artists who painted heaven from their cells, and the last echoes of the medieval sisterhood as the world around them began to change. Let's drift deeper now. The candles are burning low. Somewhere in a distant cloister, a bell tolls for Compline, the last prayers of the day. The nuns file in, eyes down, habits whispering against the stone floor. But as you might guess, not every nun went straight to her bed after prayer. Because as with any human group, seal them off, give them too many rules, and you'll soon find a wayward soul or two. In convents across Europe, the quiet rebellion took many shapes. Some were small, some not so much. Take, for instance, the curious case of Isabella of France. Yes, a princess turned nun, who discovered that chastity vows were flexible depending on who was asking. Isabella was sent to a convent not for her spiritual calling, but for being an inconvenience to her royal family. Once inside, she found a way to entertain herself. A visiting nobleman, tall, poetic, and very much not supposed to be there, became a regular donor to the convent's alms. Donations that somehow always coincided with private confession sessions. Was this sinful? Of course, but was it unusual? Not at all. The church, for all its insistence on purity, often turned a blind eye, especially when the convent in question was well endowed. Financially, that is. Wealthy nuns could buy their silence, and bishops had a remarkable ability to look the other way when the bribes came wrapped in silk or coin. Let's not pretend, though, that this was the norm. Many nuns lived lives of real restraint. But even those who followed the rules weren't necessarily the obedient lambs history paints them to be. You see, convents were also hotbeds of political networking. Noble women sent there often maintained correspondence with kings, dukes, and cardinals. They had brothers in armies and sisters on thrones. Behind the veil, letters flew, carrying secrets, advice, and sometimes coded instructions. One might say the convent walls kept bodies in, but certainly not thoughts, and occasionally, those thoughts got them into real trouble. In 14th century Italy, a certain abbess named Chiara of Montefalco became a local celebrity after claiming to receive visions of Christ. The church adored a good mystic story, until of course the mystic began to speak her mind too freely. Chiara began preaching reforms, calling out local corruption, and even criticizing the church's wealth. You can imagine how well that went over. When she died, the local priests, suspicious of her supposed holiness, decided to dissect her heart. They claimed to find tiny images of Christ's passion carved into it, proof of divine intervention. Or maybe, proof of a little posthumous embroidery. Medieval propaganda was flexible like that. Still, for every Chiara, there was a dozen nuns who lived quietly, finding small rebellions in their daily routines. Some secretly read banned books, romances mostly. Others painted in the margins of manuscripts, adding their own flair. Little doodles of cats, lovers, and strange hybrid creatures danced between the holy text. There's even evidence that some convents had pets, despite strict rules against distractions. Cats were tolerated, occasionally even named in the records because, well, they killed the rats. And sometimes, let's be honest, the rats were better company than the abbess. Let's float now to another cloister, colder, perhaps in northern France, the Abbess of Fontevraud. An order that famously accepted both men and women under female leadership, ran her house like a small kingdom. Fontevraud Abbey was massive, rich, and powerful. The abbess wielded authority over knights, priests, and local lords. Imagine that, a woman in medieval France ordering priests around. No wonder it annoyed the church hierarchy endlessly. Over time, Fontevraud became something of a refuge for noble women who preferred independence over marriage. Some were widows who refused to remarry. Others were the unwanted daughters of great houses, too plain, too opinionated, or too expensive to marry off. The abbess gave them shelter, a title, and a new kind of family. Of course, not all abbesses were saintly rulers. Some were just as corrupt as the men outside the walls. One particularly colorful abbess in Saxony was caught embezzling funds to furnish her private apartments with imported tapestries and, shall we say, a well-stocked wine cellar. When questioned by her bishop, she simply replied that she needed comfort to better commune with God. A solid excuse, really. Let's pause for a breath here, because it's easy to forget that most of these women didn't choose the veil. They were placed. For noble families, sending a daughter to a convent wasn't always about faith. It was about strategy. Too many daughters meant too many dowries. A convent required only a one-time gift, a donation, maybe a bit of land, and in return you could tuck her safely away, ensuring she didn't threaten the family's inheritance. Some girls entered as young as 6 or 7. They'd grow up behind walls, hearing stories of the world they'd never see. And while some embraced the silence, others chafed against it. Letters survive from 13th century nuns begging their families to take them home. One wrote, "I am dying here, not of illness but of sorrow." She never left. Still, many made the best of it. They formed intense friendships, emotional bonds that sometimes veered into the romantic. Historians tread lightly here, but the letters between certain nuns are not exactly subtle. Descriptions of kisses of the soul and embraces of divine love appear frequently. Whether purely spiritual or otherwise, we can only guess. But to a woman locked in a convent for life, love, in any form, might have been the only rebellion left. Let's float further, to another kind of rebellion, the intellectual one. Some convents became secret hubs of learning. Women weren't supposed to study theology deeply or interpret scripture. But inside the cloister, away from the eyes of men, they did. They copied manuscripts, debated ideas, even taught one another Latin. A few produced real works of scholarship. One shining example is Hildegard of Bingen. She was a Benedictine abbess, writer, composer, mystic, and basically an overachiever by medieval standards. Hildegard claimed divine visions, but she also wrote entire books on medicine, nature, and theology. Her music still survives, haunting, ethereal chants that float like smoke through time. Of course, her male superiors alternated between awe and unease. A woman with visions could be holy or dangerous. Hildegard walked that tightrope skillfully, always couching her bold ideas as divine messages. "God told me to write this," she'd say. And really, who was going to argue with that? As the centuries went on, convents like hers produced not just mystics, but painters, botanists, and chroniclers. Their work was rarely credited, but their hands shaped the medieval mind in quiet, patient ways. Now, while we drift through the candlelight of Hildegard's world, let's be honest. Not every nun was Hildegard. For every visionary abbess, there were plenty just trying to get through another day of bland porridge and cold floors. Life in a convent was predictable to the point of absurdity. Pray, work, eat, sleep, repeat for decades. The church bells dictated every hour, like an ancient alarm clock that never turned off. So yes, some broke rules, some broke hearts, and some just broke down. Let's float now into the next part of their world, where things got stranger still. The mystics, the miracle seekers, and those who claim to be brides of Christ, quite literally. All right, let's keep drifting. The bells have gone silent now, and somewhere out there, a single candle flickers beside an open psalter. The convent sleeps, mostly, but in one cell a nun kneels trembling. Her breath comes shallow. She says she feels the presence of God, and in her own quiet way, she probably does. This was the era of what the church called mystical union, which to modern ears sounds both holy and oddly suggestive. And that's kind of the point, because for some medieval nuns, the language of faith and the language of the body blurred into one long, ecstatic metaphor. They called themselves the brides of Christ, and they meant it, literally. Let's start with Catherine of Siena. Though she wasn't a cloistered nun, her story shaped how many convent women saw themselves. Catherine claimed to be mystically wed to Jesus Christ. The ceremony, she said, took place in a vision, with the Virgin Mary herself acting as matchmaker. Her ring, according to Catherine, was Christ's foreskin. Yes, you heard that right. The foreskin. Medieval spirituality was nothing if not vivid, but the idea of spiritual marriage caught fire. It gave women in convents a powerful symbolic identity. Not just servants of God, but wives of the divine. And once you claim divine marriage, it's hard for any earthly bishop to tell you what to do. It was, in its strange way, a spiritual loophole. Inside convent walls, the Bride of Christ motif became common. Some nuns wore veils embroidered with small golden crowns, tokens of their mystical betrothal. They wrote love poetry to Christ. They described their visions in language that hovered somewhere between prayer and passion. One nun wrote that she drank deeply of his sweetness until her soul melted like wax. Another claimed that during prayer, she felt Christ's heart pressed against hers, their blood mingling in spiritual unity. It sounds intense, but remember, these women had been raised on a steady diet of saints' lives that glorified suffering and devotion. Pain was sacred. Desire could be holy if redirected toward God, and so, when the convent doors closed, that was the landscape of the soul they lived in. Desire, guilt, fasting, fainting, vision. A cycle of suppression and expression that, frankly, could make anyone see visions after a few years of sleep deprivation and Lent season diets. Now, not all visions were welcome. Some were problematic. Take Marjorie Kempe, for instance, an English mystic who spent years crying loudly in church, claiming she couldn't help it because her soul was burning for the love of God. The clergy were not amused. They tried repeatedly to silence her. She was eventually examined for heresy. Her defense? That she'd been personally told by Jesus to keep talking. Of course she had. Nuns across Europe read stories like hers and walked a fine line between holiness and hysteria. If their visions aligned with church teaching, they were saints. If they didn't, they were witches. But many of them genuinely believed. And honestly, in a life so confined, so stripped of the world's color? Is it surprising that their inner worlds grew so rich, so intense? Let's float for a moment into Hildegard of Bingen's vision chamber. Again, because she's the gold standard of organized mysticism. She would describe her divine experiences in exact, almost scientific detail. She said she saw a fiery light, incomprehensible, full of flashing brightness, entering her mind and heart. And while she felt overwhelmed, she didn't describe it as painful, just overwhelming. Like being plugged directly into heaven's current. Hildegard turned those visions into theology, music, and medical texts. She composed chants that still echo through abbey halls today, light and slow, each note lingering like incense. Listening to her music now feels like opening a window into a still, endless night. But some nuns took their devotion further into the physical. They starved themselves trying to become pure vessels. They whipped themselves bloody, believing that pain was a bridge to holiness. And sometimes they bled spontaneously, or thought they did. Stigmata, it was called. The wounds of Christ miraculously appearing on the body. In some convents, stigmata became almost competitive. You can imagine the whispers. Sister Agnes bled again last night, from the hands. Do you think she's faking it? Probably half of them were, but half of them weren't pretending. The human mind under pressure can make the body do strange, obedient things. There was Lutgard of Ivieres, who claimed Christ appeared to her and exchanged hearts, literally removing hers and replacing it with his. There was Christina the Astonishing, who supposedly levitated during Mass and once hid in an oven for penance. The oven part is debatably symbolic, hopefully. And then there's Julian of Norwich, whose writings are far calmer. Her visions were gentle, filled with warmth and kindness, not blood and fire. She described seeing a hazelnut in the palm of my hand, representing all creation, tiny and fragile, yet beloved by God. That was her world. Quiet, inward, strangely comforting. So not all mystics were trembling in ecstasy. Some found serenity, others found fame. But all of them were, in one way or another, redefining what a woman's relationship to God could look like. Now, behind these famous figures, there were hundreds of anonymous nuns who copied their words by candlelight. They preserved, edited, and sometimes enhanced the visions. Scribes added flourishes, a little more blood here, a few more tears there. Medieval editors had their own style. And all this talk of mysticism fed back into daily convent life. You can imagine the mood. A community of women fasting, praying, meditating, waiting, hoping for some divine sign that they too were special. Visions became a kind of currency. The more spiritual experiences you had, the higher your status. Until, of course, someone got carried away. In one convent in 15th century Spain, a group of nuns began to claim simultaneous visions of the Virgin Mary. They would enter trances together, trembling and speaking in tongues. The local bishop was thrilled at first. Then the vision started including inconvenient messages about corruption in the clergy. And just like that, they went from holy women to suspected heretics. It's a pattern that repeated itself for centuries. The convent was a stage, the church the audience, and the performance only went well as long as it stayed within script. By the late Middle Ages, the church had grown wary of these female mystics. They were too unpredictable, too influential. So male confessors began keeping closer watch, reading their letters, censoring their writings, guiding their visions. Mysticism became domesticated, safe. But even then, behind the curtain of obedience, something wild remained. Some nuns still wrote poetry that sounds, frankly, indistinguishable from romantic longing. One 15th century Italian nun, Bartolomea degli Obizi, wrote to her confessor that she felt consumed by his fire. Her heart melted into honey. You can call it holy devotion, or you can call it the medieval version of a forbidden love letter. And honestly, both readings are true, because behind every mystical marriage, there was a real woman, living a confined life, surrounded by silence, channeling her deepest emotions into something the church couldn't forbid. Spiritual ecstasy. So when people today imagine nuns as quiet, obedient figures, it's worth remembering that many of them were actually burning. Not with sin, but with strange, luminous hunger. Let's drift now, away from visions and trances, towards something more worldly. Because as the centuries rolled on, those quiet convents began to attract new kinds of women. Not mystics, but refugees from politics, power, and scandal. And that's where things get complicated. Royal refugees in the convent as a political prison. Hey again, still awake? Good. If not, that's alright too. This next bit is soft and slow and full of tired royalty. So if you do drift off, you'll be surrounded by queens, nuns, and a mild scent of candle wax and disillusionment. Let's ease into it. By the late Middle Ages, the convent had become more than a spiritual retreat. It was also a convenient storage room for women who had complicated political situations. The church called it piety. Their families called it strategy. And the women themselves? Well, they often didn't get to call it anything. Picture this: a noble court in disarray, a king tired of his wife, or a scandal involving a princess who fell in love with the wrong knight. What to do? You can't just exile her. You can't execute her, not without gossip. So, you send her to a convent. It's tidy, respectable, and best of all, quiet. The walls of these places were lined with silk-draped exiles. One of the earliest and most famous cases was Joan of England, daughter of King John. Yes, that King John. The one with the Magna Carta and a talent for making enemies. Joan was packed off to a nunnery as a teenager, but eventually escaped her vows and ran off with a Welsh prince. Romantic, yes. Successful, no. The marriage ended badly, and Joan died young. Her story became a whispered warning about the dangers of letting royal women out of their cages. Fast forward a few generations, and we find Isabella of Aragon, widow of the French king Philip II. After his death, Isabella was sent to a convent for reflection. Reflection, in royal code, meant we don't trust you not to meddle. She did, of course, meddle anyway, writing letters, pulling strings, and trying to secure her son's inheritance from behind the veil. The abbess eventually banned her from corresponding with the outside world. She found a way around that too, because the convent for these women wasn't necessarily a punishment. It could be a command post, a quiet place to plan. They had servants, private rooms, and endless time. Some even brought their ladies-in-waiting with them, turning parts of the convent into miniature courts. In some rare cases, being sent to a convent was actually the safest option. Take Joanna of Castile, better known to history as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. She wasn't a nun, but she spent much of her life locked away in a convent-like fortress by her father, her husband, and later her son, all of whom wanted her crown. They said she was insane. And maybe she was. Or maybe she was just a woman surrounded by ambitious men who found madness a convenient label. She spent 46 years in confinement, praying, pacing, and occasionally refusing food until she fainted. Her story blurred the line between religious retreat and royal imprisonment. Then there was Margaret of Burgundy. She was married into the French royal family, a big deal, but got caught in what historians politely call the Tour de Nesle affair. In less polite terms, it was a royal sex scandal involving multiple princesses, a couple of knights, and a tower in Paris. Margaret was found guilty of adultery and sent to a convent. She lasted a few years before dying mysteriously, possibly strangled. But officially, of course, she fell ill. You can see a pattern forming. Convents were where royal scandals went to disappear. A noblewoman could vanish behind the walls, her story sealed under the same vows that kept the nuns silent. But not all of them went quietly. One of the most fascinating figures of this kind was Joanna of Austria, sister to King Philip II of Spain. After her husband's death, she became regent for her young son. And when he died, she chose to join a convent in Madrid. But this wasn't your average abbey. She founded it herself, the Monasterio de las Descalzas Reales, and then filled it with other noble women. The place glittered with jewels, relics, and fine art. Poor Clares in name, but not exactly poor in practice. Joanna lived as abbess and de facto queen of her little cloister, corresponding with ambassadors, controlling estates, and wearing the veil like a crown. So yes, the convent could be both a prison and a throne. It's interesting, too, how the church tolerated this double life. For all their preaching about poverty and humility, the clergy didn't mind a convent dripping in gold, as long as the donations kept flowing. In Florence, for example, wealthy nuns sometimes wore silk habits embroidered with family crests. Some even kept their jewelry, claiming it was part of their dowry and thus technically property of the convent. The line between vow and vanity was, let's say, negotiable. There are records of abbesses being scolded for hosting feasts, hiring musicians, and keeping hunting dogs. One bishop complained that the nuns under his care spent more time at the embroidery frame than at prayer. But embroidery was how they survived boredom, and also how they decorated letters, altar cloths, and occasionally secret love tokens. The convent, in essence, became a microcosm of the world outside. Its own hierarchy, gossip network, and quiet rivalries. Abbesses could be as autocratic as kings. Novices could be as miserable as peasants. There were alliances, betrayals, and, of course, rumors. One convent in 15th century, Germany even had an anonymous complaint box installed by the bishop after repeated reports of inappropriate laughter and private gatherings after curfew. The nuns, being creative, used the box to mock their superiors instead. The bishop gave up after 3 months. But life behind those walls wasn't just scheming and sarcasm. For some, it was genuinely peaceful. After the chaos of royal courts, the convent offered something rare: stability. No wars, no forced marriages, no endless pregnancies. Some noble women grew content, maybe even happy, in their seclusion. They tended gardens, read psalms, and wrote long letters that sound almost like sighs. There's a gentleness in those writings, a kind of acceptance that comes only after every other choice has been stripped away. And yet, even in peace, they were political symbols. A princess in a convent wasn't just a woman behind walls. She was a reminder, to rivals, to allies, to her own family, that her story wasn't quite over, that her bloodline, her claim, her name still existed, quietly glowing like a banked fire. Some even became posthumous legends. When Elizabeth of Hungary died in 1231, people claimed her body emitted a sweet fragrance, the scent of sanctity. She was canonized just 4 years later. Her short life of devotion and charity became a template for noble piety. But beneath the miracles, you can see a familiar theme. A royal woman turned saint because she had no other path left open. The convent absorbed them all, saints and sinners, widows and rebels, the pure and the disgraced. And in doing so, it became a strange archive of womanhood. Everything medieval society didn't know how to handle got filed under nun. Let's stay here for a moment. In this quiet, strange, halfway world, the candlelight flickers across old faces, some resigned, some serene, some plotting their next move. It's peaceful, yes, but not still. Because even within those walls, the world's power kept seeping in. Through letters, dowries, rumors, and relics.